How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Another special side note about this episode is I haven't drank in over like a week, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
And so trying to cut back on it, but then I wasn't going to drink today, but then as I thought about it more and more, I was like, fuck you, I'm having a beer or 2, 3. I don't know. Either way, you're getting my authentic self today.
Yay.
Oh, great. Very excited for that.
I bet you are. Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock. It is the podcast that I forgot. Oh, it's a podcast dedicated to the history and evolution of cult and genre movies. I am as God made me, and I am also Gary Horn, one of your hosts.
Don't blame God. You did this to yourself. I'm co-host Justin Bishop. We're joined today by writer, comedian, podcaster, Mr. Todd A. Davis. Welcome to the show.
Hey, guys.
Welcome, Todd. Nice to see
Hey.
you. Nice
Good
to see everyone.
You.
Todd, it's good to see
everyone.
you again, too. I've only been guest starring on Todd's show for like 3 weeks straight. So
Have you?
Yeah,
Wow.
there was a
can't get-
there was a
you
question about what episode he wanted to do, and then I had some gaps, and I well, do you want to just fill these gaps? And he's just like, yeah, absolutely.
it's weird. That's how my wife normally gets me in the mood, too.
He fills in your gaps.
Yeah, she's like, do you want to fill in these gaps?
Oh, okay.
Is it because you can't get anyone else to sit and talk about Star Trek Enterprise?
No, I've actually got a bunch of people who want to sit and talk about Star Trek Enterprise. That's just kind of how the cards fell. But we've got a couple of repeat guests, and I'm branching out and looking for some new folks. And pretty much, if you dig Star Trek, all you have to do is reach out and ask me.
This is not
It's
this is
because
not your
he-
Star Trek promotion podcast here, Todd.
No,
we
hey.
got work to get to.
What I found
Okay,
fun
all right,
about it,
fine.
though, just can I say, is that what it is that he's going off the chronological project, and their episodes are numbered differently than other places number the episodes. So when he told me episode this number, I watched that number, but that wasn't the right episode.
Did he give you the title of the episode?
I think he did give me the title. I just went by the number and just jumped in. Anyway, so then I went back and did the one I was supposed to. And the one I accidentally watched was actually my favorite episode so far. So I was like, well, I want to do that one. And anyway, but as if Star Trek needed to get more confusing, they did
Thanks,
this.
Todd.
Happy to help, fellas.
Oh man. So this week, folks, this is our continuation of our series on the career of Daniel O'Bannon. We spent 2 weeks talking about Alien, the biggest movie probably of his career, and again, one of probably the biggest movies we've ever talked about, which is why it took us, like 3 hours to do. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you guys enjoyed us taking that kind of really deep dive into Alien, because we don't half-ass anything around here at Cinema Shock. If we're going to give you all the information about these movies, we're going to give you like every bit of it we can find,
Absolutely.
even if it means we have to split an episode in half.
We dig deep into the catacombs of YouTube and Google and everywhere you can find anything. I was watching a Dan
And books.
O'Bannon.
I mean, I do read books as well. It's
I've
not just
what?
Google
What are
searches
those?
here.
I don't. Yeah, I can't. I don't even remember how paper works. I was watching a video about Dan O'Bannon today where he received like some H.P. Lovecraft award. And that was very interesting because he talked a little bit about Alien. Just in that he was discussing where he first fell in love with H.P. Lovecraft, and it was just kind of fun hearing him talk about that. He was proud of getting the award, and like, what is it? Like his favorite H.P. Lovecraft story is Color Out of Space. And so I think he died before that last film came out, right?
Yeah, that movie came out last year.
Oh yeah, that's right. So yeah, time means nothing. But yeah, anyway, he talked about going into buying his first like nickel edition of some H.P. Lovecraft, like a collection or something. And reading that book and being enthralled, like staying up all night reading it. And it had snowed that night. He had like a fun little story about going outside, and in the piles of snow, like one lone rose had come through the snow, and he could only think about that story, Color Out of Space, which if you've never seen it or whatever, it's like killer vegetation basically. And anyway, but he was talking about how much inspiration he got from Lovecraft as a horror writer, which I loved as a guy who also likes Lovecraft.
You can see it a lot in Alien, and I think you can actually see it a lot in this week's film as well, even though, as we'll discuss, O'Bannon's influence on this one wasn't quite as great as it was on Alien. And so you would think that, as we discussed last week, Alien was huge. It was a massive success, spawned a bunch of sequels and stuff. But after the success of Alien, you'd hope that Hollywood would be like knocking down the door of the guy who wrote it, Dan O'Bannon, but that didn't exactly happen for O'Bannon. As we discussed last week, some of the producers on that film, especially Walter Hill, really tried to kind of underplay O'Bannon's work on the film, despite the fact that he came up with the entire concept. I mean, he wrote, even though the final screenplay, yes, he was given credit, but Walter Hill essentially wrote the screenplay that made it to the screen, but all the concepts were O'Bannon's. Hell, he's the guy who got H.R. Giger involved, and the movie wouldn't be the same without that. And he had to fight to receive the screenplay credit on that film. And it was kind of a public battle that didn't do much to help the reputation of a guy who's already known to be kind of grumpy and cantankerous, But then 2 years after Alien, O'Bannon did get another film with his name attached to it, produced, although its legacy in regards to O'Bannon's actual contributions is complicated for reasons that we'll get into over the course of this episode. But that film, like Alien, was co-written by Ronald Shusett, released in 1981, and directed by Gary Sherman. Let's talk about Dead and Buried.
From the creators of Alien, terror brought down to earth.
They're going!
Fear so intense it will stay with you to the grave and beyond.
Welcome to Potter's Bluff.
2 murders in a town no bigger than a postage stamp.
When you die in Potter's Bluff, expect the unexpected.
Hell is going on in this town?
Potter's Bluff, a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to die there.
And here, I will make you beautiful again. Even more beautiful than before.
Dan, I'm dead. Please bury me.
Dead and Buried, the movie you'll want to see, if you dare to look.
Bury me.
Dead and Buried.
One thing I was going to mention, by the way, that I just remembered right now from that interview with O'Bannon was just that I wanted to say that I've come around on him a little bit. He seems more fun-loving than he comes across sometimes as we describe it. And I know Justin's on his side most of the time, but because of his rivalry with John Carpenter, I think I have like a little bit inside of me that wants to hate him. And so I'm like, he's just a grumpy old bastard all the time. But when I saw this Lovecraft interview, you could see like the passion in him. Like he was really like excited talking about it. Like he had a fun story about Cthulhu, like telling about, he's like, I've researched this. I know how to pronounce that name. He's like, there's a lot of debate about this, but I went and I found every instance where he's mentioned his name to somebody. And so like I studied Lovecraft, and the real pronunciation, this is an exclusive. It's he's like, that's the real pronunciation. And that's the last time I'm going to say that, because it's not meant for mortal tongue.
That's nice. Great. Sounds like you're speaking Klingon a little bit.
Right.
A little bit. Yeah. I was going to say that does sound very Klingon.
The other rounded off point I was going to make is you can see like why something like this would be interesting to him, because he describes that like because of the way he says you always need like a cinematic equivalent of Lovecraft's prose. And that's why he's so hard to adapt to screen. But the best one that had ever been done, he said, was Reanimator. But that aspect of Lovecraft, him going outside of his normal writing, which is sort of how this film is in a sense too, that's the best way you could even ever capture him.
So let's rewind a few years to back before Aliens production. So according to Dan O'Bannon, he'd written a screenplay called They Bite, which was later renamed Omnivore, which he calls a predecessor to Alien, saying that it is, quote, similar to Alien in tone, but the effects were much more elaborate. So then in 1975, when it was written, studios weren't keen to do a sci-fi film with elaborate special effects, a stance that would, of course, change a couple of years later with the release of Star Wars, after which everybody wanted to do special effects filled sci-fi movies. So if you've watched the 2019 documentary Memory, The Origins of Alien, which we, I think, briefly mentioned last week or maybe the week before, and if you haven't seen it and are a fan of Alien, I highly recommend that you check it out. But if you've watched that, then you heard them refer to that script, They Bite. They Bite was about these three-legged bugs that would devour anything they came across and then mimic what they ate. For instance, if the bug ate a dog, it would transform into a bizarre bug-dog hybrid. And you could see where the studios might have thought that the effects to pull something like that off would have been a little bit too difficult in 1975.
Sounds a little like John Carpenter's The Thing. I mean, just based on those very few details.
Yeah, it definitely does. Although The Thing in John Carpenter's The Thing does do a pretty good job of, I mean, it mimics, it creates a perfect replica of whatever it's mimicking. The times that we see that it's not a perfect replica is when it's either changing to something totally different or changing, or it's in the middle of changing, like when we see the weird dog monster. But like when it changes into, Wilford Brimley or whatever, it's a perfect Wilford Brimley specimen.
It starts pitching Quaker Oats like immediately. It's just weird how much it picks up on.
It honestly makes me think of the Guillermo del Toro movie Mimic.
Perfect Wilford Brimley specimen. So
Diabetes
that sounds like maybe the title of a weird punk band.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Mimic makes a lot of sense, but also we'd be remiss not to mention the Xenomorph, like how it ends up going.
Of course,
along.
in later Alien stories which he had nothing to do with, though.
Yeah.
That's so just a coincidence, but yes, I mean, the alien does it, but Mimic is actually a bug, just like an O'Bannon story. So at the time that he was working on the script for They Bite is around the same time that he became friends with Ronald Shusett. So he showed Shusett the script, hoping to get some notes from the fellow screenwriter, but Shusett actually wasn't really interested in it. He didn't really like horror films that were gory, which O'Bannon's treatment for this apparently was. He thought that gory horror films were in bad taste. And O'Bannon, if you listen to him in interviews talk about this, he kind of agrees. In an interview on the Dead and Buried Blu-ray, for instance, he explains that he's never really liked horror films that, quote, wallow in graphic mutilation. In that same interview, he also says he doesn't really like the term horror. He instead prefers to call them weird tales or something along those lines. A phrase that to me evokes the old EC comics, weird tales, tales from the crypt, Vault of Horror, things like that. I think that's kind of where he's getting. To him, these stories are appealing because of their ideas, those fantasy elements, things that can only kind of work in a genre story.
Because when I was putting together my my horror movies list, that was one of the things that I was drawn to were, of course, horror movies, but like horror suspense and horror thriller and horror mystery. I kind of strayed a little bit towards the psychological, which to me ends up being more scary. The thing you can't see, your brain fills that in. It's one thing to see.
Well, I mean, that's the appeal of Lovecraft.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, I wonder if it's anything to do with, I don't know, like the connotation that it has. Well, it's funny as we're recording this, and I think, Justin, you saw this at least, the Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs, as we record this, was just started back at season 3. And Eli Roth was on there, and they talked to him a little bit about how he hates being called a horror director. And he says it's not really that he hates being a horror director. It's just that there's a certain thing when people say that about you that he knows usually those people are implying.
Well, they're implying that you can it's like lowbrow and you're not capable of doing anything else.
Right.
So for O'Bannon, horror only worked when you focused on the moments between the scares. To him, he says that's when you create the suspense. The scares are just the icing on the cake. Like he had no problem with there being gore in a horror movie as long as the moments leading up to that, as long as they mattered, because the actual scare or the moment of gore, the moment of violence is just like the exclamation point, but it's actually the suspense that is the real scary part. I remember a couple years ago when I was at Disney World, and this kind of revelation hit me that, like, when you're on a roller coaster, at least for me, the scary part is going up the hill, that anticipation of going up the hill. What's coming, that there's something scary coming. And then
like click, 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 click.
Yeah. That's the anticipation of that is actually what's scary. Once you go over that hill and you're flying down around curves and stuff, that's just fun. That's like the fun part. The scary part is actually knowing what's coming up, what's like anticipating that something crazy is about to happen.
Or even when they
horror
first
movies are kind of the same way.
Even when they lock down the fucking thing across your chest or whatever, and it like moves a little bit, like it's got a little bit of give in there, and you're just like, is this supposed to be loose? Is this, did you click it enough? Am I too fat for this? Should I get out? I mean, I'm sure you've never dealt with that, Justin, but for a man like myself, I'm like, I don't know, is this down all the way? Like, I don't, you're like anticipating that this thing is going to fly up, and you've got to hang on for dear life when you go over the hill.
Well, and I think we've mentioned this on a couple different episodes. If you care about the characters, you're more invested in the story.
Sure. I mean, and there are horror movies where that is not the case, because they're not necessarily going for real scares,
sure. Right?
Which we'll see later on, I think, in even O'Bannon's career, with probably his most famous contribution to what would be considered, I guess, like a more traditional horror film in a couple weeks. But I don't know, it's for what he's talking about. If you're really trying to scare the audience, like I think he's absolutely right. Like, if you're really trying to get an emotional reaction out of the audience, I think that's the way you do it. And that's a lesson that Shusett took to heart when he worked on Dead and Buried a few years later. I mean, obviously, O'Bannon was able to make a solid case for horror to Shusett, because he would eventually help him co-write Alien and then help bring Dead and Buried to the screen. So Shusett's early work on Dead and Buried actually came before Alien had even been released. He had acquired a script by a couple of writers named Alex Stern and Jeff Millar that he was going to produce. Shusett and O'Bannon, the two, they would often ask each other to check out, the projects they're working on. They trusted each other's opinions. And Shusett asked O'Bannon to take a look at the script. He wanted to see what he thought of it structurally. So O'Bannon, wanted to help out his friend. He took a look at it. He offered some suggestions here or there, even helped to punch up the dialogue a little bit. And O'Bannon kind of thought that was it. That would be the extent of it. He was helping out a buddy, essentially. Well, once Alien was released in 1979, all of a sudden the two writers had some name recognition. So Shusett asked O'Bannon if he could put his name on the screenplay to help give it some credibility, knowing that it would be much easier to sell a script that was from the writers of Alien. And O'Bannon felt a little bit weird about this. It didn't really sit well with him. He felt that his contributions to the script were pretty minimal, and he didn't want to take credit where he felt credit was not due. Because remember, O'Bannon had just spent a year on Alien battling producers for his own screenplay credit on that movie. And he just didn't feel comfortable putting his name on what he considered to be someone else's screenplay. According to O'Bannon, he didn't write the screenplay. He had simply doctored it. And script doctors are a common thing in Hollywood, but they don't usually get screenplay credit.
Well, a lot of biographies of, famous or autobiographies, it's always like written by the person with.
Oh yeah. That's because
else.
The person who is the celeb or whoever's writing it is not a writer, so they hire somebody to come in and
I just
do
didn't
the actual
is there
writing
some
for it.
Is there something like that for screenplays?
No, I mean, you've got a screenplay credit, you've got a story by credit. That's it. Sometimes it will say written by so-and-so and so-and-so with an ampersand, and then the word and then another name or another couple of names. And usually that's because the final shooting script is using material from two different versions of the script, written by two different screenplay teams, or one had rewritten a previous screenplay, but the contributions of the previous screenplay were still apparent enough in the final film to where they still deserved screenplay credit, even though their script had been rewritten. Whereas what O'Bannon is doing here is he's just coming in and he's adding things and he's saying, oh no,
Punch
you
up.
should move this around.
Punch up.
Maybe this dialogue. Yeah, he's punching it up. That's what a script doctor does.
Nice.
But Shusett was pretty insistent about O'Bannon's name being put on this. So he told O'Bannon, he's like, the guys who wrote the screenplay, they're fine with it. They end up receiving a story credit on the film, so their names are still there. And O'Bannon reluctantly gave in. And Shusett told him, don't worry, you won't be embarrassed by the final product, which was never O'Bannon's concern. His concern was receiving undeserved credit because he knew what it was like to fight for that. So with the screenplay ready to go, it's time to find a director for this movie. So before this, Shusett had done some screenwriting work on a film called Phobia, which would be released in 1980 under the direction of none other than John Huston. I did not know John Huston did movies like this, but John Huston, father of Angelica Houston, famous director, guy who gave us The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, The African Queen, legendary director. He did this little movie called Phobia, and Phobia was not Huston's finest hour. John Huston was an alcoholic. Maybe he was drunk the whole time he made this movie, but it did not it got horrible reviews. The film stars Paul Michael Glasser, who was Starsky from Starsky and Hutch. He plays a psychiatrist who's developing experimental techniques to cure his patients of various phobias when his patients begin to be murdered, each according to their own specific phobia, which sounds fun. It sounds like a schlocky, fun thriller, but it was not well received by critics. The LA Times called it, quote, the worst film ever directed by a winner of the American Film Institute's Life Achievement Award.
Let me just hold on. Let me grab that knife and just twist it just a little bit. There we go.
Yeah, it's an insult, and I don't know. It's got that little bit of compliment in there. Like, we know that you're good or can be good or have been good, but this is easily the worst film that you or any other director on this list has ever made. Shusett can't be entirely held accountable for that film's failure because his script was rewritten. He was given a story credit on the film, and he was given a story credit alongside a co-writer by the name of Gary Sherman. Although Dan O'Bannon actually did some uncredited work on that as well. He did some script doctoring on that one too. But Gary Sherman is who we want to talk about. Gary Sherman is a film director who was born in Chicago but moved to London after college, started working there in commercials, and then co-wrote and directed his first feature film, Deathline, starring Donald Pleasance. It was released in 1972 under the title Raw Meat in America, which is a pretty fun title. The film was fairly well received and was a big factor in Sherman getting hired on as the director of Dead and Buried. And have you guys seen Deathline? Have you seen Raw Meat?
I've never seen that.
No, sounds fun though.
It's fun. It's Donald Pleasance is just a gem all the time. But this is like Donald Pleasance playing. You know how he plays he in the later Halloween movies where he's just like off his rocker the whole time.
Right. Yeah,
that's kind of how he plays this. Only it's supposed to be intentionally funny for a movie that is a very dark movie about people who were forgotten in London and live as cannibals in the closed down subway tubes.
That does sound like fun.
It's fun. It's pretty easy to find. I actually watched it on Tubi TV for free. If you got that app on like your Roku or whatever, it's on there. And I think Sherman is a pretty good director. I haven't seen a lot of his movies. I've seen obviously Dead and Buried, and I've seen Deathline. He would later do Poltergeist 3, which we talked a little bit about on our Poltergeist episode. But I think his work is good. And despite the final product not quite being the film that he intended, which we'll get into in a minute, I think Sherman's direction is a large part of what makes Dead and Buried work for me. Another major factor in what makes the film work, and probably something that it's most well known for, to be honest, is the special effects work by a young up-and-comer by the name of Stan Winston.
I've heard of that guy.
Yeah, you've heard of that guy, the late, great Stan Winston. I'm sure most of our listeners know that name. He's the guy who would later be responsible for special effects work in the Terminator series, Jurassic Park, Aliens, Predator. Like, he's a legend, At the time that he got the gig on Dead and Buried, though, he was still pretty early in his career. Although he was already having some successes, he'd actually won the Emmy Award in 1973 for his work on a made-for-TV horror film called Gargoyles. And then he would continue to work primarily in TV for the remainder of that decade, including, I did not know this about Stan Winston, but he created the Wookiee costumes for the infamous Star Wars holiday special.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Huh.
All that
Now,
said, and you could crap on him, but imagine this being your rookie shit. Like that's how crazy Stan Winston is. And just, I mean, the thing is he done, some of this movie stuff, but usually a lot of the work at this point was uncredited too. Like I was looking him up and he'd done some stuff like on like The Wiz and Friday the 13th Part 2, like all uncredited all around this time.
Well, I wonder if he was working for someone else, like as an assistant, where he wouldn't receive credit as like the makeup supervisor or special effects supervisor or anything like that. I don't know. I'm just curious.
Yeah, but I mean, we could do a whole series on Stan Winston, and
we probably will one day. Just primarily,
I'd be totally
so we can
down
talk
for
about
that.
Pumpkinhead.
That's pretty awesome, actually.
Just for shits and giggles, though, to give some context to his work here, when you hear him talk about it, I mean, he's like a longtime horror nerd, and he loves talking about the history of horror. And so, in several interviews, I saw him talking about one of the points he loves is like, he was really into the Universal monsters, and then horror kind of died off, and it goes into that 50s sci-fi kind of deal. But then Hammer tries to make a bounce back at some stuff that he loved. And I think The Curse of Frankenstein was one of his favorites. But it's not until the late 70s and early 80s that there's an opportunity. And he'll tell you that everyone who loves horror needs to tip their hat to Ridley Scott, Dan O'Bannon, and Shusett for Alien, because for him, he says that's when horror was finally put on the A-list. So for him, working on this project made by these people was a big deal, because he's working with people who made his favorite genre mainstream. Essentially, he wants to be part of this legacy of horror, and he sees that here.
Yeah, and I remember when I first saw Dead and Buried. I saw it in the early 2000s when Blue Underground released their DVD. That was back when, DVD collecting was a big thing. It was a big thing for me. And I was really able to discover movies that I might not have ever known about otherwise, because they were getting released by these kind of niche companies like Blue Underground. And Dead and Buried was one of those movies. And when it was first released, like I didn't know a lot about it other than I knew that Winston was involved. His name was one of the film's selling points, along with the names of O'Bannon and Shusett. But I also sort of thought the film was maybe like an outlier in his filmography, since it mostly contained makeup effects and not the puppetry and animatronics that he would, be better known for later on in his career. But I was dead wrong about that, because as I began to research this film, I started to realize that a lot of the effects that I thought were makeup effects were in fact puppets.
Like wrong. You were real wrong, because
I was very wrong.
And perhaps this is some of his most incredible work, because it's not like fancified stuff or outlandish work. This is like just, he takes otherwise mundane looking things, but it's fucking puppets. Like he made that. He made it all.
And if you hear him talk in interviews, there's a great interview with him on the Dead and Buried Blu-ray. He is a stickler for detail and realism. Like he wants to fool the audience, and he absolutely succeeds. It's one thing to fool the audience to believe that a dinosaur is real because we've never seen dinosaurs, or that the alien queen is real because we've never seen the alien queen, but we know what a fucking human body looks like. So to be able to fool me for years, it's really remarkable. I mean, it is remarkable work, especially considering how young he was and how early in his career he was just getting started at this point. So just to give you guys an example, the first victim that we see, the guy who's been horribly burned and left in the burning car, and it's a great jump scare. It's a really great sequence.
Yeah, it's fun.
That I think still remains effective. My wife watched this with me. She'd never seen it, so she didn't know it was coming, and I had forgot it was coming, and she jumped at it. And she doesn't jump at jump scares because she watches a lot of horror movies with me. I never jump at jump scares, but when he like screams, it like is fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
And it's a mixture of the sound and the look of it, but and I do think that as I watched it this time, I was like, I bet David Fincher ripped this off for that similar scene in Seven where they find the guy that's like tied to the bed and you think he's dead until he starts screaming.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know this. I mean, this is just me speculating, but I feel like David Fincher had to have seen this and gotten that idea from it. But anyway, I always assumed that this was someone that was heavily made up to look burned, but it's a puppet. It's a puppet of a skeleton with somebody's hand inside of it. And it's crazy because it looks really good.
Yeah, it definitely does. And he talks a lot about that this was a good example in this movie for him to get. He wanted to go deeper than I think how he put it was not just on the skin outward. He liked the idea of being able to work inside the body as well. So to like develop like he's building whole bodies here. And it's just pretty interesting because this could have easily, like you said, been a makeup effect.
But I think it works better this way because, I mean, if once you know that, you realize that there are the face is gaunt in a way that you wouldn't be able to get with a real person.
Yeah, I was
where
just
flesh has
thinking
been burned away.
With the makeup stuff,
you're adding on.
Yeah, it looks. Yeah. It's really hard to get it to not look bigger, but when it literally does look smaller and, for lack of a better word, gooey, it looks real, man.
He gets proud of his work too, because he said this was probably a time where Sherman must have hated him, because I think he said he argued with Sherman a lot during this one because he wanted
they argued on the set about how he wanted to shoot it, right?
Yeah, because he thought the way he had designed and envisioned the shot himself was this puppet is upright, like he's in the car and it's burned and you're going to find him like normally seated, but then it looked better that way. But Sherman wanted it upside down, like the car is, tipped, and so you're seeing it that way. And he didn't like that, and he said he fought with Sherman about it. But Sherman's, of course, the director. But now he admits he's like it still works.
It still works, yeah. Regardless, he was worried it wouldn't look as realistic upside down, but it does. I mean, it really does. So in a later scene, just a few minutes later, we see the same victim again. He's in a full body cast. And again, I assume that this was someone made up in a cast until, of course, the needle in the eye scene, which couldn't be a real person, hopefully. But I was very wrong once again. So for this scene, Winston created a full-size puppet, full-size, human-size puppet, complete with a fully articulated eye. And the reason he did that was because I think they had planned a shot where the camera actually travels up the body, like all in one shot, and then we see the needle go into the eye, so that there wasn't going to be a cut, so it had to be a full-size puppet. They ended up not shooting it that way, but he had created the puppet for that purpose. But the fact that you can see the fear in that eye.
Yeah. I was about to say, it blows my fucking mind, just real, raw emotion in that puppet's eyes.
Yes.
Or in his eye.
Just the one eye. Just the one.
Just one eye. And I never once questioned whether this is a real person or not. And that's a testament to how good Stan Winston is. This effect is 40 years old this year. 40 years old next month.
Jeez.
And it still holds up better than effects that are 6 months old.
I mean, I know crazy. we're nerding out here, but I mean, it's really one part where I was like watching the Gary Sherman commentary on this film, and I had to rewind it and make sure that I heard that correctly, because I was not aware of this. And as they're going, and the guy's asking him, and he's talking about the thing, and he's like, "Well, this was all designed by Stan Winston, like blah blah blah." And he's describing it, and the guy's like, "So like, you mean where the needle goes in the eye or something?" He's like, "No," he's like, "That's the whole thing. Like the whole thing is Stan Winston, like he did this. This is I forget the actor's name right off the top of my head. But he's like that guy was never wrapped in bandages or anything." He's like, wait a minute. Even he's like, hold on, like, this is not a real person at any point. There's never a real person in this. He's like, no, it's just Stan Winston. Like it's a puppet. And Winston gives credit too, by the way, to the other makeup artist on set. And I'm trying to think of his name. It's Zoltan Ilic. And that guy's worked on a bunch of stuff like Mask and Independence Day and like a bunch of stuff. He gives him credit too. But Winston poured over this thing. He describes being detailed with every single eyelash in that eye.
Yeah, he's obsessed with making it look as absolutely realistic as possible.
And it pays off.
Yeah.
Looks great.
And his idea, I think, was that they would do the jab straight down, but they were worried you wouldn't be able to completely get it like nail the eye, or they were worried about who was slinging it down. So it was still filmed in reverse. Like they drilled like a tiny hole in the eye and then had the needle in
the eye was
there.
made of glass, I think. Yeah. And which is probably why they scrapped the idea of doing it all in one shot, because once you stab it, you're done.
Hey, that's
it. Yep.
Yeah.
Stan Winston's probably great at parties. Like, I don't know. What if he ever fools his wife and just puts her
now or
yeah, not now. Now he's
now he's what, Justin?
Bit of a buzzkill at parties now.
He's dead, Gary.
Are you sure? I think we've seen here that may not be the case.
So one of the film's more extensive effects was the reconstruction of the hitchhiker that was played by Lisa Marie, who is not the Lisa Marie that's in like the Tim Burton movies. I was like, there's a different Lisa Marie, but it's an incredible sequence. And it was filmed and edited by Gary Sherman, but it's the effects work by Winston that really makes it shine. So you guys know the scene I'm talking about, where we're looking down at the face being reconstructed. So to achieve this effect, Winston took a life cast of Lisa Marie. And I love that they used this actress who has such a distinct feature. Like her nose is very distinct. She looks like she's from Whoville.
Yes, you bastard!
Oh my God, yes.
I literally wrote that in my notes. I was going to make that reference. She's got her cute little Whoville nose.
But they took a life cast of her. Winston, the way he describes it is he essentially started carving away at the face of the life cast, carving it down to a skull. So he's doing what they're doing in the movie, but in reverse. And then he used that as a base to recreate her face a little bit at the time. So when you see the scene in the movie, that's Winston's hands on screen actually reconstructing the face as we watch. Like when he's so you've got this gooey skull that he created, and then, putting bits of muscle and bits of skin on. Those are Winston's hands in the scene. Of course, they edited it for length. But then the scene cuts to this side view of a nearly completed face, and we see him like open up her eyelid to reveal an empty socket. That's when you realize as a viewer that this is not the actress laying there, because
they actually popped Lisa Marie's eyeball out.
It's pretty fucking realistic looking.
Lots of eyeball violets, by the way, so this took a lot out of me.
I'm sure this was tough for you, Gary. But this scene, you've got Winston's hands doing the work, because it was a very complex scene to pull off, and they needed his expertise. So those are his hands in the scene. We see him put the eyeball in, like lift back the eyelid, put the eyeball in, and then he pulls his hands out of the shot. The shot never cuts. And then when we see the hands re-enter the shot, those are actually the hands of actor Jack Albertson, who plays Dobbs, the mortician. So the camera then, this is again, all one shot. The camera pans up to show Albertson's face. And while the camera is panned up, the Lisa Marie puppet is pulled out of the scene off camera and then replaced with a gurney where the real actress, Lisa Marie, is laying on it, so that when Dobbs leans down to kiss her head and the camera follows him down, he's kissing the actress on the head.
Wow.
And then we see him leave the room and the camera lingers. Again, there's no cuts. And we see another figure walk up, which we never find out who it is. I don't think, although they explained who it was supposed to be in the commentary. But after that character puts their hands on the hitchhiker's head, she sits up, and it's all one shot. And so much is being done in this one shot. It's really it's astounding work. They didn't have to do it that way.
Yeah.
But it works so much better because
really smooth.
Yeah.
Yeah. I never got to the Shusett commentary, but in Sherman's commentary, he can't remember. I think he describes like not being able to remember why they did that with the other person coming up. And
it's apparently supposed to be the Janet character, Melody Anderson's character, who I think he speculates that maybe she was somehow activating, the magic that brings her to life or something like that.
That could be. The part that, this is one of the things where we'll get more into detail with this. So I'm not trying to skip ahead here, but this is one of the spots where the changing of the guard studio wise, this movie switches between 3 studios. We'll talk about that more in a bit, but this is one of the parts Sherman talks a lot about. This is out of place in the movie where this happened. This is one of the earlier kills in his version of the film, because Lisa Marie appears earlier in this version of the film as one of the people, but anyway, because I think you're going to talk about that in a minute, but he had a cool idea about how this transitioned as a shot too, to like where she gets hit with the rock and then is on the gurney and you see her mangled face. Like he had the idea of what's his face, the sheriff coming up and finding her and seeing her. And then there's the camera scooting up like on them overhead and him walking away and it coming back down. And then she's on the gurney and he had this whole thing, but the studio that jumped in, like nixed that whole thing because they were like, that's an ending scene in a movie. You can't do that in the middle of the movie. And he's like, the whole point of this movie is to be unnerving and weird. Like he's like, I like that. And he fought with them a lot there. But and I brought that up to say, because as we're talking about Stan Winston, I do want to point out that the absolute worst effect in this film is the one where the doctor friend gets off.
Yeah, who's getting the stuff up his nose.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that whole area is according to Sherman, this was never part of the plan. Like that whole thing.
Well, let's say first of all, that was not Stan Winston.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's I was gonna say this is not, they couldn't get Stan Winston back. This is added in later. That
it's a reshoot.
Sherman says this guy was supposed to be in on it already. This is all Dobbs' puppet show. So for him it made no sense. And the reason I thought of it, is that he also hated the part that, or he couldn't remember why the lady comes up to activate him and acts like almost like Dobbs doesn't know about the people being brought back, because he was like, oh, now you're lying to the audience. And he's like, this is, clearly Dobbs is the big bad at the end. And he's like, so why would Dobbs not just be there for this? And so Sherman clearly has issues with some of the stuff in the movie.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that part doesn't make any sense, but there are several things in this movie that don't make any sense that to me doesn't affect my enjoyment. I'll give more thought on that later, but that's one of them. I mean, it's like, I mean, it looks cool, I guess, but it doesn't really, Dobbs should be the one bringing her back, if anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about the writing, we've talked about the director, talked about Stan Winston's effects. Let's talk a little bit about the cast of this movie. So the cast isn't exactly made of like well-known actors, but there's some really great character actors that make up the townsfolk of Potter's Bluff, many of whom were hired because they simply looked the part. That small seaside New England town look, which it does evoke, again, Lovecraft, I think, by the setting of this movie. And much like we talked about with the cast of Salem's Lot a few weeks ago, how a lot of those characters they feel authentic. They really feel like they live in this little kind of seaside town. But there are at least a couple of faces in here that you might recognize, even if you don't realize it. The first of which, we already mentioned him, but that's the great Jack Albertson as Dobbs. He's the guy who ends up being the big villain of the film. Albertson had a long career dating all the way back to the mid-1920s. He got to start on Broadway, but he did appear in more than 30 films in his career, beginning with a small role in Miracle on 34th Street, the original one. Most of you probably, though, know him as that fucking lazy ass Grandpa Joe and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
Okay. I was like, God, he looks so familiar, and I could not place him for the life of me.
That's him. That's Grandpa Joe.
Wow.
That fucking mooch.
Albertson's awesome, man. He is a vaudeville OG. He didn't make a shit ton of feature films, but he's one of the only actors, to fit into that category of having won an Oscar, a Tony, and an Emmy. All he's missing is the Grammy to be part of that. I think there's even a name for it. EGOT. Yeah. But yeah, he was in the Sunshine Boys, where he got a Tony Award, or no, he got a nomination there. And I think it was, the subject was Roses. He got Best Supporting Actor. He would also get that for when it was adapted into a feature film. He would get Best Supporting Actor in the Oscars for that. He also got nominated. No. I was thinking he got nominated for Grandpa Joe, but that is not correct. He probably did not get nominated there. Nobody cared.
Well, Albertson was kind of known as a comedy guy. He's playing very much against type here.
His Emmy was for he's the man in Chico and the Man.
Right.
He's that guy. So yeah, he was on variety shows all the time. And yeah, actually, I think he got a second Emmy for appearing on the Cher show or something. I remember reading. So I had a quote here from him where he talked about just him destroying everything he touched. He was saying, I started out in vaudeville and vaudeville died. I hit the burlesque houses and they padlocked them. I tried radio and you know what happened to radio? Then live TV and it vanished. Now I finally got a toehold in movies and look what's going to happen.
He's great, man. And this was his final film. This is his final film role. He died during post-production on this. So this was I don't think he even lived to see its release. He was battling cancer during the filming of the movie and nobody really knew, but yeah, you'd never know because he's given it 110%. Like this is a powerhouse performance. He is so much fun to watch in this movie. Well, he's one of my favorite things about the whole movie.
Well, dude, they said Sherman says that he knew he was sick then because he would have these moments of like he was heavily medicated. And there's a scene where James Ferrantino comes into his office and who's the sheriff, Albertson's at the table or at the desk and Ferrantino's talking to him. And he says at one point when they're shooting the scenes of Ferrantino's dialogue, like straight on shots of him, Albertson started like nodding off. And at one point, like nodded off straight back or something and was just out like a light. And he said Ferrantino was like reading his lines and freaked out and jumped up and ran away.
He probably thought he died right in front of him.
Yeah.
Well, so he said, Sherman says he followed Ferrantino and he was in his trailer and he was crying. And he said that his father, I think, had died the same way, like mid-conversation.
Wow.
Yeah. And had died. And like he just had like a flashback when he thought Albertson was just dead, like right there sitting there talking to him.
Oh, that's crazy. So, well, I guess let's talk about James Ferrantino. So James Ferrantino plays the lead of the film, Sheriff Gillis. Prior to this, Ferrantino was probably best well known for his roles in 1980's The Final Countdown, which is a movie I really want to talk about on this show one day because it involves time travel, and I think it would be fun to break Gary. I always like breaking Gary's brain with time travel movies. It's a really good movie. And also he was in the 1977 TV miniseries Jesus of Nazareth, for which he received an Emmy nomination for his role as Simon Peter.
Interesting.
Because, this guy looks like a Middle Eastern Hebrew.
Yeah.
Just like everyone else in that movie. So I think he's very good in this, though. It's kind of a shame he didn't have a bigger career as like a character actor. I mean, he worked consistently, but he's not a leading man type necessarily, but for something like this or in character roles in bigger movies, I could see him having a big career.
Yeah.
And then starring as his wife, Janet, was Melody Anderson. So Anderson was fairly new to screen acting, but she had just recently filmed a starring role in Flash Gordon. And Flash Gordon was a film that was poised to be one of the biggest movies of the decade. Everyone thought it was going to be huge. It was going to be like the next Star Wars. Queen did the soundtrack for it. And they all thought that like we got, Melody Anderson on this before everyone knows who she is. Like this is going to be a big deal because she's going to be a huge star by the time our movie comes out, and it's going to help our box office and all that. Well, it turns out Flash Gordon was a big flop, like one of the biggest turkeys in box office history. It's a fun movie, I think. I mean, it's not a great movie, but it's a fun movie, but it did not do very well at the box office. It was a pretty big failure. So her being in the movie didn't really amount to much of anything. Although, I mean, she's very good in the role, but but her star, there was no star power there. And then you had Barry Corbin as a townsperson named Phil. He would later go on to have a long running role on Northern Exposure. You've also got Lisa Blount as, well, Lisa is also her character's name. She's the nurse / model at the beginning of the movie. Mm-hmm. Blount would later appear in An Officer and a Gentleman. That was probably her biggest role. And she's also in John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness. Then she would later become a producer, actually. As she was, I did not know this about her. So I started looking into Lisa Blount. I knew she was an Officer and a Gentleman, but I didn't know that she had a career as a producer. But as a producer, alongside her husband, Ray McKinnon, who's a character actor who I am a big fan of. I really like Ray McKinnon. Blount actually won an Academy Award in 2001 for Best Live Action Short for a film called The Accountant, which was directed by McKinnon. And he stars in it as well, alongside Walton Goggins in a very early role. It's a really good short film. I've actually got it on DVD because our friend Andrew Molinaro, a friend of ours.
Yeah.
He, that all three of us know, he actually introduced that to me when I first met him in 15 years ago or whenever it was, not long after this movie came out or the short film came out. And he gave me this, he gave me a copy of the DVD, and it's really, really good. And I had no idea that it's so weird seeing how it's connected. You'd probably recognize Ray McKinnon, even if that name doesn't ring a bell for you. As a character actor, you have probably seen him and stuff. He had a very long running role on Deadwood on HBO as the preacher who ends up getting like a brain tumor. Spoilers, I guess, for a 10-year-old show. But he's really good at it. And then we've got the town tow truck guy, Harry, played by a young actor named Robert Englund. It's already our second Robert Englund appearance. Englund had already appeared in Tobe Hooper's Eaten Alive by this point, and he had also just made a made-for-TV movie called Mysterious 2, although it actually would not air until 1982. It aired on TV after the release of this movie, but it was filmed beforehand, and that film was written and directed by Gary Sherman, who had personally offered the Dead and Buried role to Englund. He wanted him for this. And I looked up Mysterious 2 because the name sounded really familiar to me. I was like, that sounds familiar. Have I seen that? And it turns out that I had heard it because I was recently watching a Heaven's Gate documentary on HBO. The Heaven's Gate cult.
Oh, yeah.
Marshall Applebaum.
Yeah.
And the film is actually loosely based on the story or I said Applebaum, Herf Applewhite, and Bonnie Nettles. And the story, the movie tells the story of two aliens who visit Earth to try to enlist converts to travel the universe with them. So basically, Gary Sherman took the idea that was behind this weird cult. That this is two and a half decades, 2 decades before their famous mass suicide. But they were established for a long time, and they were already fairly well known. And he took the story of what was like the conceit of their cult and built a narrative around it, which is kind of wild. And I kind of want to see it, honestly. Nice. I kind of want to see this movie. But yeah, they talk about that in that HBO documentary about the cult. It's pretty interesting.
This is still all before Freddy. If we do a Robert Englund series at some point, we'll have like a lot of his early career covered.
Yeah, I mean, this is not long before Freddy. This is 3 years before the first Nightmare movie? Because the first Nightmare was 1984. So he's going to blow up pretty quickly, not too long after this. But I don't know what other movies. I can't think of any others that he was in.
I was just actually literally like I had it pulled up here in IMDb, and I was like, it's just like all TV shows pretty much. Besides like he's in a movie called Galaxy of Terror, and then it's like straight up TV all the way through to Freddy.
Yeah, I think he did the V miniseries during that time, maybe.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
So the actual filming of Dead and Buried was pretty uneventful, although there were some bumps along the way as ownership of the film changed hands. Gary alluded to that earlier, and we'll talk about that in detail here in a minute. But the film was filmed almost entirely on location in Mendocino, California, not actually filmed in the Northeast where it's set. I mean, they never really say where it's set, but it's pretty clear that this is supposed to be like New England. Yeah. There's that one guy, the one character who has that really thick Maine accent. I think he's the hotel owner, the guy who owns the hotel. Yeah. I love that guy. He's a great character. This film's filled with great little side characters like that. I think that really, it's really populated with some very memorable people, even sometimes in very small, sometimes, very few scenes.
Yeah, the Fred, I think the guy's name is Freddie in the movie. And I cannot for the life of me.
Freddie is the photographer at the beginning.
Yeah. So that guy, Sherman talking about, hindsight, like he would have hired, he would have tried to pitch to fork over extra money for like a bigger star for that role, just because it would be a lot of fun, almost getting the psycho treatment of having, the guy at the beginning and then he dies. Also, it would be a big deal when he's revealed again later.
Yeah, because that character is not, because the actor is not like immediately recognizable. if it wasn't for like the music in his reveal scene where you see him turn around, to direct the people to the gas station, it would not be super clear that that's the same guy, because he just doesn't have a super recognizable face. Yeah, if they'd got a slightly bigger star in that role, I think that would have been a little bit more effective. I definitely agree with that. He's wearing a similar hat. I guess that helps.
Right. The interesting stuff there is, it's worth mentioning, a lot of the people that were hired on this film were Sherman's regulars. Like he had people that he liked working with. Obviously, Stephen Poster is the cinematographer on this one, and he had worked with Sherman back in those industrial commercials and all that crap that we talked about earlier, and he brought him on. But they had a real idea to like flush the way this movie looks, and like it's supposed to always look cold, and even though that it's in California and obviously on a beach, but it's supposed to kind of seem like on a northeastern like beach, sort of. But so like that opening scene, for instance, they filmed during the day, and they couldn't, he talks about the day they went out and filmed that they couldn't call a weather day because it was bright and sunny, but it totally went against like the look that they were going for. Yeah. So they actually designed like a huge tarp that went over the whole area and like some silk, and they used like certain ways. The Poster did some things with lenses to like try to really give it this cold look, there, that it's not bright and sunny and happy. And I don't know, they fleshed it was interesting, they fleshed out all the reds in the movie. Like originally there was supposed to be literally an idea Sherman had was no reds at all, except for Lisa Blount's blouse at the beginning. Yeah. And that was it. And so that when there was blood, it would be like really startling, it would stand out. Yeah. And but of course the studio transitions changed that as they added more gore into it. But I don't know, they went so far as to like changing taillights in cars to purple and that sort of thing.
Okay.
It's
wasn't
one of those,
just me. I saw those and was like, what?
Yeah. It's one of those subtle things that you don't necessarily consciously know, but it does add to the overall mood look of the film. Because the thing is, when I think about Dead and Buried, I think about it being like a very cold movie, very cool colors, everything in blues and grays,
Yeah.
Very, very, I don't know, faded. There's just something about it. And the reason that they chose Mendocino was because it most closely resembled those New England seaside towns like Potter's Bluff. And Sherman and his crew specifically chose Mendocino. Mendocino is in Northern California. And they chose it specifically because of how regularly the area was covered in fog. In fact, they would base their shooting days around how foggy it was outside. So there were times when if it was foggy enough, they'd do exterior shots. If there wasn't enough fog, they'd shoot some interior stuff. So at a certain point, though, they ran out of indoor stuff to shoot, which led to the scene where Gary was talking about, where they were forced to shoot outside on a sunny day because they couldn't. They're like, we don't have anything else to shoot, and we have to get this shot to stay on schedule.
Yeah.
And one of the scenes that posed some challenges is the haunted house scene in the middle of the movie. One of my favorite sequences in the movie, where the family's being like stalked by the townsfolk. So for this scene, the laws in Mendocino County wouldn't allow them to shoot at night because of child labor laws. And there's a kid in the entire scene. So to pull it off, they had to construct this huge tent that completely covered the house to make it appear to be nighttime outside. And it had to be big enough not only to cover the house, but all the outside lighting and everything as well that we see through the windows. So as Sherman described it, the tent took up an entire like city block. Basically, it's just like the biggest tent you've ever seen, because they had to do it. They had to make it look like they were out. This wasn't shot on a set. The house they were shooting in was a house, so they had to actually cover it to make it seem nighttime. That scene was actually supposed to appear much later in the film, but by the time post-production rolled around, the production company who was calling the shots thought the film needed a scare scene earlier. And if you look closely, you can actually see the hitchhiker character among the townsfolk. And at this point in the movie, she hasn't appeared because that, like Gary said earlier, the hitchhiker scene was supposed to be earlier. This was supposed to be later. So she's actually, you don't know to really look for her until you've seen the movie a few times. But yeah, she's in there among the people who are stalking them when they burst into the house.
Well, it drove Sherman nuts because he was like, of all the people that we could have cast for this role when they're going to screw around with the scenes, it's Lisa Marie, and she's got that cute little Whoville nose. So she stands out. Like, how would you not notice her face? But he says that, now, again, hindsight, he's like, I guess nobody ever seems to know that except me. So he's like, I guess maybe they were right on that one. The family, by the way, I mean, that kid is in a later scene in the schoolroom, which is supposed to have been also earlier on in the movie, which was going to be the first conversation between the sheriff and his wife. But again, I don't think that one matters that much because I guess you could just assume that kid's a zombie kid or something.
That was kind of my assumption, was that he got turned into one of them, basically. All right. So about those production company changes, when the film was first in development, it was being produced. This shocked me, by Guinness, the beer company. Guinness.
It blew my mind too, right?
Apparently Guinness was wanting to get into film production, so they bought a studio, but their foray into film had not been going well and did not last very long. They'd had a couple of disasters and decided to pull out about halfway through pre-production on Dead and Buried. So then the production company that Guinness had hired to oversee the film ended up taking over the production, using funding from a different source. And they oversaw the rest of pre-production and pretty much the entirety of the shoot. And they were apparently pretty easy to work with. By Sherman's account, these guys loved the movie. They loved his vision for it. They loved the tone. They just generally were into what he was doing with it.
Nice.
But then the film got sold to a third company during post-production, and I'm not sure why. I could not find out why the rights got sold, but it got sold to a third company during post-production. And these guys, they didn't quite get what Sherman was trying to do here. They told him, if we wanted a horror film by Bergman, we'd have hired Bergman. I guess they saw it as being too artsy-fartsy for their taste. But they didn't hire Sherman in the first place, so they didn't really have anything to do with hiring the Bergman of horror.
They, I think Sherman said it was just that second company got bought out by a bigger studio or something, and so it was just that. I don't know. The Guinness thing was funny, although it's not. That was marketing back then, because I think all around that same time there were people doing, Guinness also did the Book of World Records. It was like another way to get your name into something else. Like Michelin had the restaurants up the coast of California, like the restaurant guide, and it was like a different way of marketing to get you to drive up and down the coast to check out these other restaurants, and somehow that would connect to their tires. And it was I think it was Michelin anyway.
Michelin starred restaurants.
See, I knew you would know that. I'm not fancy like you. But
Michelin starred restaurants are a very well-known thing, but
well, I sort of knew. But anyway, so I guess it makes sense. Maybe they were trying to just throw themselves into the movie industry and also, market that way as well. They thought it'd be a good idea. But the second group
for them,
I don't know. It just it started getting, this is where the studio meddling thing starts coming into play, and scenes get moved around, gore gets increased. People think it needs to be something different than what the original dark comedy feel that Sherman might have thought it was going to be, or that's it.
Yeah, these guys, they kind of had a very different idea of what the film should be. They did want more gore. They wanted more titillation. They demanded that Sherman shoot some additional scenes and restructure the film a bit. Like the scene where we see the old drunk fisherman. That scenes were that were expanded to be more violent. Like that scene, his gory death wasn't originally in Sherman's original version. He cut away when it was obvious that the man was about to be murdered, but they wanted to see the murder. So they had to go back and do reshoots. So that one wasn't shot on location in Mendocino. They filmed that on a stage. And Sherman is not entirely happy with the resulting film. If you listen to his commentary, this is not the movie he meant to make. The tone is very different from what he'd intended. Like you said, it was supposed to be a dark comedy, and there's not a lot of that there. And not a lot of that is left intact, except for some of the performances, like specifically Jack Albertson, who are playing really like purposely broad. But other than that, there's not a lot of the comedy left in the film.
I'm interested how the tone would have impacted things. I mean, because for me, I mean, for better or worse, I actually think the movie's pretty fantastic. But
yeah, I do too. But despite the fact that Sherman, it's not the movie he meant to make, not exactly the movie he meant to make. There's a lot of what he wanted that he intended that's still here. But I'm very curious about that. But unfortunately, we'll never know. This isn't like they're going to be where something, there's going to be a DVD or a Blu-ray down the line where it's the original Sherman version of this movie, because this production company, when they bought this, or when they had the movie recut and rearranged and reshot, they then ordered that every other copy of the film be burned. So there is no existing cut. So sorry to everyone who was trying to release the Sherman cut trending on Twitter, but it is not going to happen because it does no longer exist.
Yeah, he had a director's cut that was going around. They screened it at a couple of places, right? But it was going to cost too much money for that to exist by the time the third studio came in. So yeah, it was destroyed, and that's sad. But
it is really sad. It is really. There have been other cases where we think that every copy of the film has been destroyed, and then they've been found in some warehouse out in Utah somewhere or something. So who knows? It could happen, but it's unlikely at this point.
Yeah, the studio wanted to make more changes. I mean, Sherman, when you hear him talk about it now, like he seems more at peace with it, that it still ended up getting some recognition and it has like a cult following and that sort of thing. That at least, because it's not so much that everything got changed. Just the tone is different than what he had intended it to be. But
and they added gore.
Yeah, they added more gore. So it kind of ruined the red thing that we were talking about. And, he talks about the studio wanted to make more changes than that. Like part of Dobbs, Albertson's stuff is all like he's playing it broad, like Justin said, just because he's definitely comedic or he's trying to have fun. And he's playing that big band music. They wanted to get that out of there. They hated that.
Yeah, I thought it was great.
It's a great character, like just quirk.
But he said there was too much trouble. Like they were just like, he's in too many scenes and too many different ways it's included that they were just like, fuck it, basically. So you still get Dobbs carving faces up to big band classics. So just like Duke Ellington intended, it's still there. And, speaking of Duke Ellington, by the way, the score is beautiful. I love the music in this movie, and that's by a guy named Joe Renzetti.
Who did Chucky, I think, right?
Yeah, he did Chucky. He did a bunch of stuff. He's a longtime music industry person. He was best friends with Gary Sherman. Gary Sherman also did early work as a studio musician. And so he worked with Joe Renzetti and got him in there. And Joe Renzetti got a Oscar for the score in Buddy Holly, the Buddy Holly story.
Oh, the Buddy Holly story? Nice.
Yeah. And so that was him. And he said he would try
Nick Nolte, or
I think that's right.
Nick Nolte?
Yeah.
Is Buddy Holly?
No. Yes. Wait,
Gary
who is
Busey.
Buddy Holly?
I get
Gary
them mixed
Busey.
up.
Yeah, it's easy to do. Everybody does that.
I get them mixed up.
Yeah,
it's Gary Busey, who also won, I think, an Oscar for that.
Yeah. So anyway, that's how they met. But he said with the music, I guess it's kind of funny. He was just telling like a little side story that he would try to get him and Renzetti were friends, and he would try to get him on stuff all the time. But like people would be like on TV movies and stuff, and they'd be like, we got somebody already. He's like, this guy's an Oscar winner and I can get him on this. And they're like, yeah, but that, after the Oscars, it doesn't matter anymore.
Wow. Yeah. So I guess even after these changes were made, the production company who distributed it didn't have a ton of faith in the movie because they did very little to promote it, aside from commissioning a pretty kick-ass one sheet. I love the poster to this movie. I think it's rad. There's no imagery from the movie on it, but it's just a really great poster, I think.
It is weird because it doesn't look like anything. Like, I mean, I don't know. Like it's a weird
other
image.
than it's on a beach, I think. But other than that, yeah.
I thought it was like the fucking Statue of Liberty or something. Like,
right.
Or it's like
it's a cool poster, but
or something.
Has nothing to do with the movie hardly. But anyway, they didn't really do a lot of promotion on it. I mean, they had a trailer, they put it out and everything, but they didn't really push it hard. As a result, the film did very little business when it was released on May 29th, 1981. It only played in 83 theaters for about a week per screen, and it made a measly $216,000 at the box office. It was pretty much ignored by critics and audiences alike, although it has gone on to have quite a cult following. I mean, we're still talking about it right now,
Yeah.
There's even a 40th anniversary 4K Blu-ray release coming out from Blue Underground later this year, which I'm going to have to double dip on that one and get it because it's got a lot of new material on it.
Nice.
So not the Sherman cut, unfortunately, but a lot of new, interviews and things like that, new commentaries. So I'm excited to check that out.
We should have waited.
Well, but I'm guessing that not everyone in 2021 is a huge fan of this movie, Gary. I'm betting there are people who watch it and aren't fans.
I will say this. A lot of people, sometimes I say somebody needs a nap, but a lot of people apparently did get their nap because there's not a lot of reviews. Like it's the least amount of reviews I've seen on sites, or at least
maybe they're
one-star
currently
reviews.
napping.
Yeah, they're still currently napping.
Yeah.
But leave it to the internet. No matter what you do, no matter where you go, the internet is always there. And so people find a way to express to you that somebody needs a nap. So the easiest ones to start with are like from Amazon because they're short and sweet, to the point. Like this guy, 80s stud, who says he gives it 1 out of 5 stars. His title of his review is "Consider the 1 star the biggest pile of crap you've ever seen." I guess I don't know what that means exactly. It's like a star-shaped poop or something. Anyway,
it's a good trick.
Yeah.
God, does that mean you have a star-shaped butthole? Like so it's like one of those
starfish?
Like one of those Play-Doh, like one of those Play-Doh molds?
Yeah. He just says, "God, this is terrible. Don't waste your time."
That's the review?
Yeah, that's the review.
Oh,
this is from FPOTC, who just title is "Don't Waste Your Money," and the review is "Not scary." Yelling.
Wow.
Then Jason G here says, "The intro was so god awful that I couldn't stand to force my ears to listen to the crap music anymore. My fault for picking this movie, but when I go into the horror genre to pick a flick to watch, I want action, suspense, madness, mayhem, not a 5-minute piano walk on a beach." That's what he said.
Wow.
Brian says,
I really like that opening.
So did I.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Brian says, trying to make up for poor writing, it's difficult to believe such accomplished veteran actors would waste their talent on this tripe. The title of his review is "Typical Gore and TNA." I don't even remember boobs in this movie. Were there boobs in this movie?
Yeah, Lisa shows her boobs in the opening scene.
Oh, okay. All right. But if you want the real reviews, you got to go over to IMDb for this. So I've got
There's some good ones on Letterboxd, Gary. Here's one just to butt in on your segment here.
Oh, go ahead.
By a 1-star review from a guy named Silver.
I got to start looking at Letterboxd more.
Says, "I made a lot of poor choices in my life. Watching this movie was one of them."
Oh.
But this is my favorite one, and this is the last one on my list here. This is from Thomas 196X200029.
That rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it?
Easy to remember username. His review is titled, "This is a disgusting film. Really started the 80s trend of disgusting violence masquerading as a horror film. I was the target audience for this repellent piece of trash, and I was disgusted then as now. Oh, where do we start? Let's see. The setup. You could bring people back to life if they died a violent death. So that laughably weak premise is the excuse to butcher people in horrible ways because, well, that's needed to bring them back to life, I guess. That might have worked if played over the top for black laughs, a la Reanimator or something. But no, it's played straight. There is a whole terrified family in a wagon that gets hunted down. One of the few scenes, at least, where the demise is off screen. However, just about everything else is on screen. There is actually a scene where a young girl walking along is beaten and killed by zombie townspeople who are all filming it and grinning with several cameras. Then There is a close-up of her face as the filmmakers lovingly and time-consumingly reveal in time-lapse photography her beaten face being carved down to a skull and rebuilt to look normal again. This done, of course, by a slumming Jack Albertson as the mortician behind it all. He likes to drive around in an ambulance/hearse playing old Tommy Dorsey tunes. I guess that is supposed to be cute. In the end, of course, even the sheriff is undead and the doctor offers kindly to fix his rotting hands. Not clear why the sheriff is not out with the other townspeople, killing children with glee and slicing their faces off, sticking needles in burn victims' eyes. But I really, really wonder what people see in a geek show like this to give it any kind of rating at all. It's not scary, the twists are laughable, and overall it's kind of sick. It's not even well enough done to see it on a dare or enjoy on a level you might watch a bad H.G. Lewis film. It's just god-awful trash made for people who get off on this type of pointless gore and made by people slumming for a paycheck. I'm sad that Albertson was even involved.
Wow.
Let me ask both of you guys, how much and with what frequency did you get off with all this horror? I am curious as to the numbers.
I mean, how long's the movie?
Yeah. I'm not really the person.
You stop keeping track after a while.
I am a chronic masturbator, clinically diagnosed, so I don't. It's really not so much what's in front of me as just the desire to do it,
You mean that literally and metaphorically, right?
Right.
Okay.
So I can kind of understand with this movie not vibing with audiences in 1981, because this was at the height of the slasher era, which is undoubtedly why the company that bought the rights to the film wanted more gore in it. Gore was what was selling in the early 1980s. This is a year after Friday the 13th.
Right.
It is sort of astonishing, though, that despite all of the restructuring and tinkering with the film, the movie still works really, really well to me. I mean, Gary's kind of already tipped his hand at this one, but I think this works incredibly well. I would, however, like to know Todd's take on this.
Like I said, I really dug the opening, and I thought the music and the slow setup to the photo shoot that was happening on the beach, and then the random woman, I was kind of like, all right, this is kind of this slow burn type horror movie. I'm like, all right, cool, I'm in. And then as we've discussed, between the effects, really solid cast. If I'm going thumbs up or thumbs down, I'm going thumbs up. This was really good. I was pleasant. This was not on my radar in any way other than doing it for the show.
Like you were not familiar with the existence of this movie.
Correct. Yeah. I was not familiar with this one at all. So I went into it clean, fresh, never seen before. And I really enjoyed it at the end of it. Now, the thing that really got me in the end, because, I'm on board with it. I'm a big Philip K. Dick fan. And when we get the reveal, because there's two reveals in this movie. And the first reveal is kind of like, oh, okay. It's been a slow burn to that. But then we get the second reveal. And I don't think that we talked about that at all. And it's that, spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen it, but
if you're listening to this,
if you're listening to this, but the second reveal that the sheriff is also dead and has been apparently for a while. To me, that was such a Philip K. Dickian reveal. And, in looking back at the plot, seeing the paranoia and suspicion of everybody and, what is happening here within this story, there was a lot of Philip K. Dickian things happening there. And then looking at all of the characters that are dead and how their clothes don't change and they're always just kind of there, they're in character the whole time. And I was just like, man, this is an onion of a movie. Like, it's got a bunch of layers, and
it's an ogre of a movie.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ogre of a movie for sure.
Well,
and
so
I really enjoyed it.
To me, that ending is less Philip K. Dick and more that's Lovecraft. That's a Lovecraft ending. And it's also very much like an EC Comics ending.
I was going to go with, like Tales from the Dark Side kind of thing, or, Creep Show or
Creep Show, Tales from the Crypt. Like that's a Tales from the Crypt ending.
Right.
I was like that is
like Lovecraft meets Philip K. Dick, and that like he's a government official, like trying to, solve the mystery.
Honestly, this whole thing, the whole movie feels like an EC comic to me.
Yeah.
It really feels like it could be an episode of The Twilight Zone or an episode of Tales from the Crypt or a segment from Creep Show. Like there's something about the overall vibe of the story that's just kind of what I get from it. Like I could very much see like a shorter version of this being in Creep Show or Creep Show 2 or something, Right. It just has that feel to it, that shock ending that you expect from those old EC comics. And I do think that this is incredibly well directed by Gary Sherman. I think Gary Sherman does really, really good work here. I think he leans into I think that he treats the material like art in a way that a lot of directors would not. Like he does not ever feel like this material is like below him. He's treating it like an important movie. And, some of that is like, for instance, the decision to take Red out of the movie. Not a lot of people who are making what is essentially a B movie. It's a movie about the undead. It's a horror movie, a fairly low budget horror movie. Not a lot of people are going to take the care to do something like that in it, to worry about the color scheme of the story. But he's really trying to do something special, which I think is why he's probably so annoyed with some of the changes that were made in it.
Yeah, he said, look at his commentary towards the end when they ask him when it's running the credits, his final thoughts is that he said his first inclination was to disown the movie and completely shut it down, but that he says stepping back that maybe it ended up okay, that he's all right. He fought it for so long, and he had his version, but the third studio wouldn't foot the bill for it, like we said, and destroyed all the copies. So he said he was getting worn out, and then he had Robert Ramey, it's Rehme, Bob Ramey is what he calls it. He's a producer, executive producer on a shit ton of stuff. Like came in and he said actually that's where they made their friendship, and Robert Ramey said, you're just going to have to trust the process on this one. Let's move on and let's try to make another movie. And so that's when he went on to make Vice Squad.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he seemed at peace, with the whole thing.
Well, I think that he has a really good eye for, or a really good instinct for crafting sequences in this. I mean, that opening scene, for instance, that Todd remarked on, like that's incredibly well done, and it builds to a point where you're like, it goes on just long enough to where you're starting to feel, I don't know, comfortable with the scene, but also like you're going, what's going to happen? Like what are we building to? But you never think that it's going to build to what it builds to, which is all these people just pop up out of nowhere and fucking murder a guy, or they think they murder a guy, and then the follow-up in the hospital with the same character is even better. Like it's just really kind of intense,
Yeah. Yeah. Very
probably my favorite sequence is that haunted house sequence, which kind of is a standalone little sequence in the middle of the movie, but it's really well done. It's very intense in a way that the rest of the film is not. The way that we see like the shadows in the windows behind the family.
I definitely wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Yeah. And he never really draws attention to it, but they're there. And it just makes it extra creepy. Like if he had drawn more attention to the shadows, I don't think it would have been as effective. But the way that he does it, he's trusting the audience. He's trusting the audience to see what's going on. And it's just really creepy. It's really, really creepy. And yeah, the family's making dumb decisions. Like I think the wife tells the guy to go down in the basement, like, oh, maybe the people are in the basement. Maybe they blew a fuse and they're fixing it down there. Like that's really stupid. Yeah, that's really stupid logic. But it's just one of those horror movie logic things you just kind of have to go with. But it builds a really great sequence. And here's another fun fact about that sequence. So we talked earlier about how they had to like cover the whole house with a giant tent. Well, they actually had to have fans in that tent as well. These big loud fans. I think they had to like blow out exhaust and things like that. And they were so loud that they couldn't record any dialogue, which is why when you're watching the scene, it seems like the mouth movement and the dialogue's a little bit off, is because they had to go back and dub the whole sequence over. Like if you're watching an Italian horror movie where they dub everything, they had to dub everything over, which in my opinion, I mean, it kind of adds a whole nother surreal like layer to the whole scene that just makes it seem weird. Like the whole movie's just got a weird off-putting vibe to it, intentionally off-putting and weird.
That was supposed to be the whole point. I mean, that's all that Sherman wanted out of the movie. Was the whole thing to make you uncomfortable, it to be weird. And he does. You're right. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know much about Gary Sherman, but just hearing him talk about it, I kind of like became enamored with the guy. Like as far as like his mind, like he seemed to, like you said, really care, and he seemed to treat it with seriousness, which you want from a horror director, to try to make it the best movie you can make it. So his whole thing with like studio meddling was just like all the stuff he had idea wise seemed to be screwed with, and so it seemed like he was just one of these guys, the first instance of getting to make a decent budget movie and people are screwed with it. And it's not good experiences, by the way. He even tells the story, either an interview or the commentary, where the second studio brought in a guy to oversee the production, and the guy was an alcoholic. He said like the guy had like no sense of what was going on. So the worst instance of it is that they depended on him to handle certain aspects of it, and he didn't handle those that almost caused like serious accidents on set. One example he gave was that they had to close off a road, and the guy was supposed to have contacted the police department to close off a road they were filming on. He said it was kind of like a out of the way, like stretch of road, but like they're filming, and all of a sudden this car comes barreling 60 miles per hour around the curb, like at the crew, and they all have to like dive out of the way because it turns out this guy was drunk when they were talking about it and didn't ever call the police and, closed the road. They thought it was like a closed off road. And
jeez,
that's crazy.
Yeah. And so he was just like frustrated, like generally.
That's a frustrating experience. Well, another one of my favorite sequences in it is the whole found footage sequence towards the end of the movie. The black and white. And Sherman, I think he said it was shot on 16 millimeter black and white, but that whole thing is very, very creepy. Like handheld, like weird angles, like it's very creepy. And it kind of has a visual style that you would see in a lot of like horror films from the 90s and 2000s, like early 2000s. Like it had, like I thought of like the some of the 16 millimeter footage from the House on Haunted Hill remake, had that kind of same similar vibe to it. And it's a really great sequence. I remember watching it this time and just being kind of fascinated by that. Like this is pretty early on in the found footage genre, even though this is not a found footage movie. Like that's still very much a found footage scene. And not only that, but it leads to one of the big reveals in the movie, which is that the wife is, that she's not only in on it, but she murdered a guy. Then, another twist on top of a twist. That guy's you.
Yep.
It's really good. It's really excellent.
That's the sad part of it, is because to hear Sherman talk about it, he's really proud of these moments. And like, they're even getting away with it appearing more violent during those scenes because they're like black and white. And so you get away with a little bit more of the gore type stuff, but it's not as like overpowering, just like gore for the sake of gore. And it's just like kind of off-putting. The whole thing gets off-putting. And then he talks about that scene, just like the this woman just stabbed a person mid coitus, and I don't know why I used that. Anyway, I'm just really happy with myself for saying mid coitus.
You just like to say, or happy you got to say mid coitus.
Anyway, so they're in the middle of making love. She stabs this guy, and he's like, And then you're surprised because it's her. It's the wife. And you're like, fuck. But you're not even thinking about who did she stab?
Yeah.
And,
you're like, she's cheating on her husband. She's murdering a guy. And then they reveal that the guy is the hero of the movie. And then we've got,
because his whole thing, by the way, is, I think I said this earlier, but it's that it's Dobbs' puppet show. It's like he's already kind of controlling all of this. Like he controls everything here, which is more the reason why he was frustrated with, like, say, the doctor scene, because he's like there, or, even just in certain parts, he was like, the messing up of it is that, like, you start lying to the audience. And he's like, I'm not trying to lie to the audience. I'm trying to make it fun for the audience. And it's like a mystery you could figure out. But when you start just like, now you're also lying to the audience, you're like trying to make it, he's puppeteering you, but you're supposed to be enjoying the movie. Like he's puppeteering the sheriff in this town, and, like that whole thing.
Wow. Yeah. And not everything in the movie really makes logical sense. Like, the whole plan, like what is Dobbs doing? Like, why is he doing this? It doesn't matter. It doesn't make any sense. It's never explained. He simply says, like, I'll take my secret to the grave. And it's like, that's enough. That's enough of an explanation to me. Yeah. Like he's got his reasons. Is it voodoo? Is it witchcraft? We don't really know. There are hints here and there, but they never explain exactly what's going on. Or like the fact that, like, in that last scene, there are just projectors set up all over Dobbs's office or whatever.
Beams of light. Yeah.
Yeah. Why would those be there? It doesn't matter, because you know what? It makes it for a pretty fun looking scene. Oh yeah. If you start thinking about the logic of it, maybe the whole time he set him up just so that he's like, one day I'm going to have to do my big villain monologue, and this is going to look really cool when I do it.
I think Sherman even straight up says, like, he and the cinematographer, like, they were, Stephen Poster, were talking about that. It was just like, I just want beams of light pointing everywhere. Yeah. And just like, it'll look cool.
It looks cool.
It looks dope. It's pretty awesome.
But we haven't done this on the last few episodes because I don't know. I want to do this only when it feels like we've got some really good options. But I would like to discuss movies for further viewing on this one, because I think there could be some really fun ones. And it's funny. I know Gary, one of the movies that I had for my further viewing on this, I know Gary watched this week, and I wonder if it's for the same reason, because it feels very similar. And that's John Carpenter's The Fog. I think John Carpenter's The Fog would make a really good double feature with this movie.
It does, but that's not why I watched it. I just watched it because I like John Carpenter, and I just watched The Fog again. Jennifer was like, I haven't seen The Fog in forever. I'd like to watch it. And I was like, sold.
Yeah, they just feel like two sides of the same coin. You've got this small town now in The Fog. Obviously, the dead are not members of the town; they're pirates or whatever. But I don't know. It's got a very similar feel to it. A lot of fog in both.
Yeah. Well,
but yeah,
it's true.
That would be my further viewing, other than Raw Meat. I think if you want to watch another Gary Sherman movie, that's a fun one to watch.
I mean, I suppose like it gives away the spoiler, but I mean, Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, feels like a pretty similar concept. And I only just say that just because you reminded me of it when you're like, I don't know why Dobbs did this. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe he's Herbert West and he's just
he's just
because I can. Like, I just have to see.
A mad scientist.
Yeah.
A mad scientist.
I would go ahead and I'm sticking with my Philip K. Dick stuff. And I would say probably Total Recall or maybe Scanners. I think that would be a fun double feature.
How so?
Just the paranoia and what involvement it does the hero unknowingly play in the whole plot.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, I get that. Now, as we've explained, Dan O'Bannon seems to have had very little to do with Dead and Buried. I know we're doing a Dan O'Bannon series, but he didn't seem to have a whole lot to do in crafting this movie other than some contributions here and there. I know that like Jack Albertson, the first scene we see him in, where the sheriff comes in to see him in the morgue, Ron Shusett says that that's all like Dan O'Bannon's dialogue in that scene. The Jack Albertson's dialogue was all rewritten by Dan O'Bannon there, but it's kind of unclear on just how much of this. It seems to be very little. is actually O'Bannon's, other than, the ideas were not his in this case. He just cleaned things up a little bit. But that kind of seems to be the thing with Dan O'Bannon a lot. He has this, he has his hands in a lot of projects, but is never really the auteur, the author of the final product. You could say that he co-authored, Dark Star with John Carpenter. You can even say the same about Alien, because he undoubtedly helped to bring that film to the screen. And next week, we're going to kind of continue this trend with a movie that O'Bannon was marginally involved with. But again, he was marginally involved with Star Wars. But hell, Star Wars is like the biggest movie of all time. So it's kind of cool that like one guy is doing all these different things. And next week, to my knowledge, the movie we're talking about, O'Bannon was not involved in the production of it all. But it's an anthology film that features 2 segments that were written by Dan O'Bannon. Next week, we're actually discussing the first animated movie we've ever talked about on this series here on Cinema Shock. And we're going to discuss 1981's Heavy Metal.
Nice.
Have you guys seen it?
It's been years.
I was going to say,
I'm really looking forward to it.
Not since I was like a teenager, I don't think.
Cool. Well, it should be pretty easy to find. If you guys want to find out where to stream it, we'll have links up on cinemashock.net.
I was masturbating to it, and I can't remember if it was because of the movie or
probably or just because you were like 14 and that's all you ever did.
Yeah, I just masturbated a lot. So we'll find out.
You can also head to cinemashock.net to find links to all of our past episodes and where you can subscribe and all that. Rate, review us on all those things. You guys got anything else, friends? Where can you be found on the internet?
I can be found at Mr. Todd A. Davis on all the socials. And if you like Star Trek, I have a podcast called the Computer Resume Podcast, and it is on Apple and Spotify and Amazon. And we're working our way through the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order. Both Gary and Justin have been on multiple times and probably will again in the future. But we're having a lot of fun with that series right now.
This is Gary Horde. And I also have a wrestling show too called This is Pro Wrestling.
It's like pulling teeth to get Gary to promote his other show on here for some reason.
I'm not sure whatever the crossover is, but yeah, if you like wrestling, I have a show called This is Pro Wrestling. It's at TIPW show on all the social medias. You can check that out.
And I'm at Justin_Bishop on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. You can also find the show at Cinema_Shock, Twitter and Instagram. You can also like us on Facebook and all that stuff. Until next week,
may the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
And be excellent to each other.
Johnny has the keys.
Oh, we didn't get like a variant of it this time.
No, I tried to think of one and it's just like, you know what? I'm just gonna make it as happy as possible.